Hello everyone, welcome to our class this week on Area Studies. Today is our second session on African Studies. And as I told you before, my name is Kidinji Kenywa. I do research on African politics and society using disciplinary approaches of area-based global studies. I hope that you will enjoy today's session, and if you have any questions and comments, please do not hesitate to email me. As a reminder, let me emphasize that my approach to this topic is based on the discipline which I am trained in, which is area-based global studies. As we think about African studies, I want us to pay attention to the relevance of area studies knowledge in a new, more intense phase of globalization, thinking about how we can approach African studies from that perspective and how that can make it a little bit more different. We therefore want to continue asking, does globalization, defined as a process of global flows of capital, people, and ideas, offer or accelerate the mission to the need for area studies? As you think of this question, please bear in mind that the entanglements of globalizations are site and situation specific. So to be fully understood, they require the understanding of cultural, historical context that are provided for by area studies. Like I said previously, in this sense, one of the biggest challenges of area studies is the purposive realities of globalization. Historically, area studies has tended to focus on state-centered projects of modernization and development. And area-based studies calls for grassroots globalization or globalization from below. In this section, we have mentioned area-based global studies, referring to global studies that are area conscious, meaning they involve awareness and willingness to cross the dominant conceptual boundaries and bring forth newer conceptualizations of the peripheries. This new shift emphasizes a decentered approach that helps us understand the diverse webs of realities on the vast continent of Africa. To understand Africa as a subject of area studies, we suggested engaging in four key questions and the key concepts, which are: what is Africa? Who is an African? How is Africa talked about? Or in other words, what is the nature of the discourse of Africa in the global political order? And finally, how should Africa be studied and who should study Africa? If we think through these concepts and questions, as I said before, we can conceptualize what actually the nature of African studies is. And in such, I would like you to make your own conclusions of what is African studies, guided by these critical questions that may provide you a world view. Before we start off today, I still want to encourage you to familiarize yourself with Africa's political geography. So assuming I give you this plain map of Africa, look at it carefully and then think about if you can fill in the names of each of the African countries therein. I want you to make a small goal in these sessions to be able to transform the previous map into something like this with names of the African countries in it. Now, today we will discuss the third question: where is Africa? Of course, as we said before, the easiest way to ponder this question of where is Africa is to locate it geographically. And I want to introduce a somewhat different dimension to that approach. Last week we said that area studies was an academic enterprise that took at its basic units of analysis territories that were often products of European imperialism and contained within their boundaries bewildering variety of social, economic and cultural forms. So wended into Euro-American conceptions of nation-state and progress, and to the comparative approach in which Western civilization was the normative case, area studies projected the differences within sovereign states and the areas they constituted onto the boundaries between them. This state-centered approach often reinforced a static view of culture and geography and the interrelationship between the two. The areas to be studied tended to be viewed as relatively immobile aggregates of traits which were more or less durable historical boundaries and with a unity composed of more or less enduring properties. An argument that is made by Pandra in 2001. Now, area studies posited the other as somehow beyond or more usually behind in the developmental sense. The political, economic, and socio-cultural structures of modernity effectively denying the coexistence of multiple complex modernities, including forms of alternatives to resistance to the Euro-American project. Now, from the beginning, area studies then was an integral part of the modernist project that sought to remake the world in the image of the West. And it was assumed that power of national states to define territories and culture and history were prominent. The type of knowledge considered useful was the knowledge that generated and was applied towards an understanding of processes of modern social change, particularly state in building an economic development. So ultimately, all this was viewed through the lens of American economic, political, and strategic interest in particular parts of the world. Then, we must pause to ask, how did this view of looking at the world influence the understanding of Africa as a place? I want us to understand the place of Africa in the world by looking at two scholars that I have selected to explain how discourses on Africa looks like. We will examine this subject by taking into account two issues that James Ferguson and Binyavanga Wainaina have raised. Wainaina will help us to understand how Africa is framed in the global political discourse in his article called How to Write About Africa. In his part, Ferguson picks up on a similar theme and shows us how Africa is often a shadow in global political discourse. But he helps also to bring in an interesting aspect of how an African himself actually understands his place in the global political order. Let me invite you to read with me some sections from Binyavanga Wainaina's article. Of course, we cannot read everything, so let us focus only on the highlighted parts. I begin. Always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Peace Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use this. In your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. Africa is big. 54 countries, 900 million people who are too busy starving and dying and warring and immigrating to read your book. The continent is full of deserts, jungles, highlands, savannas, and many other things. But your reader doesn't care about all that. So keep your descriptions romantic and evocative and unparticular. Your African characters may include naked warriors, loyal servants, diviners and seers, ancient wise men living in erratic splendor, or corrupt politicians, inept polygamous, travel guides, and prostitutes you have slept with. The modern Africa is a fat man who sits and works in the visa office, refusing to give work permits to qualified Westerners who really care about Africa. He is the enemy of development, always using government jobs to make it difficult for pragmatic and good-hearted experts to set up NGOs or legal conservation areas. Among your characters, you must always include the starving African, who waters the refuge, comes nearly naked, and waits for the benevolence of the West. Her children have flies on their eyelids and pot bellies, and her breasts are flat and empty. She must look utterly helpless. She can have no past, no history. Such diversions ruin the dramatic moment. We continue to read. Broad brushstrokes throughout are good, and having the African characters laugh or struggle to educate their kins or just make do in mundane circumstances. Have them illuminate something about Europe or America in Africa. African characters should be colorful, exotic, larger than life, but empty inside, with no dialogue, no conflicts or resolutions in their stories, no depth or quirks to confuse the cause. Describe in details naked breasts, young, old, conservative, recently raped, big, small, or mutilated genitals, or enhanced genitals, or any kind of genitals, and dead bodies. Remember, any work you submit in which people look filthy and miserable will be referred to as real Africa. And you want that on your dust jacket. Do not feel queasy about this. You are trying to help them to get aid from the West. Readers will be put off if you don't mention a light in Africa and sunsets. The African sunset is a must. It's always big and red. There is always a big sky, wide empty spaces, and game are critical. Africa is the land of wide empty spaces. I would have loved to continue, but please let's continue to our exploration of this text. Now, so take your time and have a few minutes to reflect on this reading. I don't know what you make of it. What kind of writing is it? Who is the audience? What is the message that the writer has? And what tone does he take to communicate his message? Now, how to write about Africa is absolutely spellbinding essay by a Kenyan writer called Binyavanga Wainaina. I think the title of the essay is provocative, and Wainaina shrewdly approaches the title of the essay to produce in itself an ironical statement that may confuse you about the context and the content of the essay. Even though the title, How to Write About Africa, might suggest being an essay that describes wisdom on landscape of Africa as a continent, this is actually not the case. The title of the essay actually connotes an ironical statement on the Western perceptions and false impressions of Africa. And thus, the essay is in actual sense about how not to write about Africa. As an African writer, the essay resonates with a frustrating tone about exaggerated portrayals of African continent and the stereotypical impressions created by the Western eyes. Thus, How to Write About Africa brilliantly focuses on these impressions constructed about Africa to deny them as utterly absurd and false, using satire tone that mocks the assumptions on the African continent by the Western writer. In this essay, Wainaina offers decryptory and severe satire and advice to Western writers about their stereotypical portrayal of Africa. The writer jumps right away from sarcastic guidelines for Western writers to pinpoint a list of cliché words to use for the titles and subtitles of their book, including Africa or darkness or Congo, Nile or big. The essay further moves on to suggest that the cover of the book should always contain a photograph of an African who embodies an AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breast. The writer further asks the Western writers to always see Africa as one country, even though Africa is big with 54 countries. But never be precise about any of this because your readers don't really care about all that. What feeling should you have about Africa? Wainaina suggests that Africa has always been pitied, worshipped, or dominated. For the African people, he asks that the writer to absolutely make sure that they are empty inside, but they should have music and rhythm in their deep down souls. So he suggests that African characters should always include naked warriors, loyal servants, and ancient wise men living in amatic splendor. Even more, a necessary character that needs to be present in the story is the starving African. The writer further goes on to use satire to say that real Africa is always when there is abundant mention of filthy people and their suffering, miserable life. And then when writing about Africa, the writer asks the Western writer to establish that impeccability, the impeccable liberalism that portrays how much they love Africa and can never live without her. Africa is a beautiful place because of their sunsets. The writer reminds Western writers to never forget to include them. At the end of the essay, Wainaina provokes anyone who writes about Africa to always end their book with Nelson Mandela saying something about rainbows and renaissances. Because this shows that Western writers care immensely about the dark continent of Africa that can only be saved from the doom by the Western intervention and your important book. Now, in our endeavor to understand African studies, we need to pay attention to elements of Western perceptions mentioned in Wainaina's provocative satire to expand on, particularly its reductive nature, ambiguity, and savior complex, which results in possessiveness Western powers feel over the continent. The homogeneous nature of Western narrative of Africa is a consequence of obsession with mundanity that has led to the marginalization of the deep past, which locates an African as not in the present, but in the exotic past. Some people have argued that such a relation and a limited knowledge of Africa is in relation to power and implies the fear of Occidental nations of being upstaged or squared by the rich histories of the continent. The idea of Africa as a savage and dark place would thus be redundant, and the continent's global platform would be, as Wainaina desires, worthy of legitimate attention. The idea of obscurity, brought up repeatedly in Wainaina's essay, fortifies the reductive nature of Western perception as it leaves space for presumptions which often justify the imposition of international policies and non-governmental organizations under the cover of international aid. On a political platform, NGOs especially have been placing the blame for structural problems on African governments and acting as surrogate for government in the meantime. From this political substitution emerges a trope known as white saviorism. This is sorry, self-serving gesture, which opens the door for others to see it as act of charity because without your intervention, Africa is doomed. So victimizing the continent and its people is a method of attaining and maintaining superiority glossed over by the label of philanthropists. Infiltrating a continent through the guise of humanitarianism results not only in the imposition on political, social, and economic platforms, but also reduces the legitimacy and evolution of a powerful Africa. This is not to say that all international aid is negative, but simply that relations between the West and Africa are mostly relations of inequality and dependence relative to power. In Wainaina's sentimental descriptions of white saviors, it draws upon the Western perception of helpless African in desperate need of a hero to maintain the possessiveness felt by the Occident as the byproduct of salvation. The dramatized nature of his words merely shows how absurd the Western image is on Africa. This places the accountability for the study of contemporary Africa on Western scholarship and media, challenging them to report the complexity of the relations rather than the simplified version. The overarching idea in Wainaina's essay can be summarized as overpossession with a single story. That is so much evident in Western tradition of describing Africa that shows people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they end up becoming. So this projection of Western ideology has produced a category we call Third World. In Third World category, Africa is a singular monolithic subject in Western texts which have colonized the materials and historical heterogeneities of African lives. How an African person is described is thus one of the serious implications to study the contemporary Africa brought to life through Wainaina's essay. It challenges the notions of single story, which has thus far been the dominant story in Western media, and consequently the power dynamic that comes with it. As good students of African studies, we should seriously reconsider the implication of such views as we critically inquire the challenges and the character of contemporary Africa. Of course, this calls for approaches that are more and more so tactics that seek to accommodate diverse stories of the continent. And as Chimamanda Ngozi asserts, the consequence of single story is that it robs people of dignity, it makes our recognition of equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how different we are rather than how similar we are. Wainaina has given us an intriguing view of how rhetorics of African continent and its people are shaped. Now, our next reading, Global Shadows, is somewhat connected to Wainaina's idea, but more specifically, James Ferguson in Global Shadows is asking the question, where is Africa, by giving a reflection on normative and theoretical premises that have been used to study African socio-political context in the past 2 decades. He seems to pose a question: what can we say is the place of Africa in the world? And I think his answer to this question is also clear, that Africa is neither sufficiently connected to the capitalist globalization, nor is it traditional, or is it in the modern palace in strictly different in its socio-cultural foundations. The readings directs to the fact that to understand Africa requires that we engage in the question of Africa and the political economy of globalization, which at large involves the concept of historical failures of modernization as an international project that shaped all aspects of international involvement in Africa throughout the post-World War II. Taking a critical addition to modernization does not need to evoke the benevolent external agencies or need for education for Africans. Instead, it calls us to pay attention to historic, material, and more importantly, how Africa views himself. When Africans lament that their life circumstances are not modern enough, they are not necessarily referring to cultural practices. They are speaking of what they view as shamefully inadequate socio-economic conditions and how low rank in relations to other places they are. So again, let's read together before we put these views into context. The shadows of an Africa in the world keep creeping in, insisting on an ongoing relationship between Africa and the West, and an ongoing responsibilities as consequences thereof. Claims of like-mindedness in this context constitute not copying, but a shadowing, even a haunting, and declaration of comparability, an aspiration to membership and inclusion in the world, and sometimes also as assertion of responsibility. I continue reading the Ferguson piece. Why, when one has a valuable culture of one's own, would one seek a copy, a bad copy at that, of a culture of the colonizer? The aspiration to European house, this is speaking to a story that is indicated in this article, forced me to see was not a matter of blind copying. It was a powerful claim to a chance for transformed conditions of life, a place in the world, a standard of living, and direction we would like to move in. Now, historically, Western societies have found in Africa a radical other for their own constructions of civilization, enlightenment, progress, development, modernity, and indeed history. So Africa has become a counterpart that mirror in a mirror that in which differences with the West were highlighted. Trope of absence. Africa is absent object, set always in relation to full presence of the West. The aim of Ferguson's work, called Global Shadows, is to debunk the idea of Africa as a sum of different localities and peculiarities. He asserts that Africa is a place in the world that contains large-scale issues to be analyzed. Things like modernity, globalization, social justice, inequalities. in concern with Africa as a category that has been constructed and has been reshaped by the conception of world and the global order. So in this way of conceptualization, globalization is a key tool for analyzing Africa. And as we stated in the course, we are emphasizing methods in area-based global studies. So key argument by Ferguson is that although globalization seems a global phenomena, in Africa, it is usually ousted in this process or marginalized. In this regard, Africa has a negative place in the globe, both location and ranking in a system of social categories. This construction of Africa by anthropologists and Westerners in general not only influenced scholars but also Africans themselves, who build their identities on this basis. In other words, negative considerations of Africa not only misunderstood the social reality of the continent, but helps shaping and consolidating these ideas among Africans. So understanding how an African understands its place in these categories that have been used to depict Africa, usually in a negative way, has a promising turn, despite a complicated one. It may help us understand, for instance, the introduction of formal democratization of African states during the 90s, and that did not, in actual sense, result to democracy, in the most strict sense of the word democracy. The question, is Africa part of globalization, is key to our new understanding of African studies that I want us to adopt. And Ferguson states that the place of Africa in the neoliberal order is usually decidedly a subordinate position. It then does seem that this way of viewing Africa has informed and inspired the production of images about Africa that we encounter today. This is a key question and it will help us to understand the kind of an approach we should adopt in doing Africa area studies in the age of fast globalization. Through Global Shadows, we get tools to discuss African studies in the light of globalization, focusing on how globalization has reconfigured political, economic, and cultural relationships in Africa. So some of the key points from Global Shadows, the book, global processes may seem to ignore and exclude Africa, but at the same time, dynamics that marginalizes Africa also generates supranational and transnational networks of power, capital, and resistance that profoundly shape the continent. So looking at some examples would be one that James Ferguson gives in his book, the rest of the book, which he uses the case of international financial institutions, donor states, and non-governmental agencies such as World Vision, which he says these transnational apparatus of governmentality threatens and subverts the authority of national governments. A second example that he uses is the growth of mineral extractive industry, and especially oil, copper, and gold. And he says they shift control of the revenues beyond boundaries of national state in what he refers to as deteriorization. In one of the chapters, he gives an example of Angola that shows extremely lucrative offshore oil facilities coexist with some of the worst poverty rates in Africa. Now, let's give a conclusion to these two readings. These two readings sort of, in summary, makes us to think of reconceptualization of Africa as a focus of area studies. To analyze properly the reconfigurations and relocations of organization and power that have occupied Africa, we must develop new categories and adopt new methods and tools, which may include to to study particular locales and context to inform large discussions regarding social relations, modernizations, and mobilities. I think we also need to make sense of mimicry and the place of the African culture in the age of globalization in a bit more newer way. And then we need to recognize the topographies of power and how they work. And they are not just national, but they are also transnational. They are not just vertical, they are also horizontal. We need to acknowledge multiple conflicting and intersectionalities of politics, economics, and cultural logics that operates in the contemporary Africa. Finally, we need to be aware that globalization is not neglecting Africa, but actually remaking Africa. Thank you for this session. I will see you in the next video.